Mi nombre es Ángel Soto, soy profesor asociado de la Universidad de Navarra y estamos esta tarde aquí para presentar este libro, Pensamiento Social Católico, el mercado y las políticas públicas, desafíos del siglo XXI, editado por EUNSA. Y lo primero que me han pedido es que haga un pequeño spot publicitario, como corresponde. Pues que nadie se vaya de aquí después de la presentación sin comprar su ejemplar, que está a la venta ahí arriba. De lo contrario serán ustedes placados por la seguridad del edificio. Bueno, en primer lugar, expresar mi agradecimiento a EUNSA por haber apostado por la edición en español de este libro, cuya versión original en inglés tenemos ahí, en esa mesita roja, editado por St. Mary's University Press, que también es el libro con el que se lanza esta nueva editorial universitaria, y también al máster que nos ha estado apoyo en esta sesión de presentación. Y por supuesto, en el sentido, pues, al conjunto de la Universidad de Navarra, que nos cede este espacio y hace las veces de anfitrión esta tarde. También añadir unas palabras de agradecimiento a los que aquí me acompañan, el profesor Philip Wood y el profesor Andrea Acevedo, que han tenido a bien, pues, confiarme en la traducción al español de este libro. Así que todos los problemas que encuentren en el libro son problemas de traducción, no problemas de sus autores / coordinadores, porque este libro es una colección de ensayos. Bueno, acto seguido voy a pasar a leer el extenso currículum de las personas que aquí me acompañan. Philip Wood es catedrático de Pensamiento Social Católico y Políticas Públicas, investigador senior para el Centro para la Empresa, los Mercados y la Ética en St. Mary's University, Twickenham, en Londres. Es graduado en Economía por la Universidad de Durham y doctor en Economía por la Universidad de la Ciudad de Londres. Ha desarrollado una amplia carrera académica profesional, ha sido durante 15 años director académico de investigación del Institute of Economic Affairs, ha sido asesor del Banco de Inglaterra, ha sido director del Wilson Center de la Universidad de Buckingham. En fin, un largo etcétera, una enorme y prestigiosa carrera, tanto en la academia como fuera de ella, en el ámbito de los think tanks. Así que es un placer tenerte con nosotros, Philip, bienvenido. Y por otro lado tenemos a Andrea Acevedo Alves, catedrático de la Universidad Católica Portuguesa, donde coordina también el Centro de Investigación del Instituto de Estudios Políticos en Lisboa. Participa en los programas de grado, máster y doctorado en ciencia política, así como en relaciones internacionales. También es profesor de la Universidad de St. Mary's en Londres. Él es licenciado en Economía por la Universidad de Oporto y máster en ciencia política por la Católica Portuguesa, así como doctor en Gobierno por la London School of Economics y Ciencias Políticas de Londres. Es un miembro de la Sociedad Montpellier y también Andrés es una persona muy activa en la vida pública portuguesa, colaborando con numerosos think tanks en Portugal y fuera de Portugal. Así que, bienvenido, welcome, Pele. We will switch to English now. Sorry about that, about my poor English. I'll try to do my best to moderate this discussion on the book. So perhaps we could start by having each of you refer to the book and the reason why you decided to do this book, to release this book, for perhaps 2-3 minutes each, and then we go to specific themes and questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Juan. And I've absolutely no idea what Juan said about me, but I'm deeply grateful to Juan for inviting us here tonight, and also for undertaking the Spanish translation of our book on Catholic social thought, the market and public policy. And actually, this was a journey which began about 2018, when we first started discussing with the Templeton Foundation the possibility of a grant to develop a wider project. We have a website, catholicsocialthought.org.uk, but also this book and other resources. And the reason really was because at the time, there's a sense in which there was a pincer movement from more conservative angles as well as from the left, which was becoming opposed to the various aspects of a market economy, including, for example, attacking globalization, which of course you see the manifestation of now in terms of President Trump's policies, a more hostile climate to business and so on. And we wanted at least part of this book to discuss how over the previous 40 years, the development of globalization, the business economy, and the business economy which was evolving in a situation where governance was improving in a number of countries across the world. So the communist countries had fallen in 1990, Asian countries had liberalized, corruption was falling, there was an increase in democratic regimes, there was an improvement in human rights and so on. And this was actually a pretty successful period for the world economy. It was an incredibly successful period for reducing poverty, and it was an even more successful period, which is not widely understood, for reducing inequality as poorer countries caught up with richer countries. So we thought it was important to make that case, and it's even more important to make it today than it was back when we first thought of this in 2018. But at the same time, we had of course, the financial crisis and the periodic episodes and individual incidents where people behave incredibly badly in business and people suffer as a result. But the number of people who suffered in the financial crisis of 2010, which stretched on into 2010, in 2011 and 12 and so on, was enormous and out of proportion to anything that had probably happened since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And its effects really still linger on. In the United Kingdom, productivity growth has been way behind what it was, for example, before the financial crisis. So we wanted to address the importance of ethics in finance, the importance of ethics in business, and in a sense respond to the call of Pope Francis, of Pope Benedict before him, and Pope John Paul II before him, to ensure that Catholics really took seriously the idea of having a rightly ordered business economy ordered towards the common good, which not only promoted prosperity, but promoted flourishing across a number of dimensions. Finally, I might mention the creaking of welfare states as Western, as a demography in the Western world, but also in parts of Asia, has reached a situation whereby the population is not replacing itself, and aging populations have become unaffordable, imposing very large tax burdens on working generations, as well as explicit government debt, which is creating huge tensions in Western democracies. I think is largely responsible for the rise in Western populism. And we wanted really to rediscover that Catholic tradition, which was always supportive of welfare institutions, which emerged out of civil society, emerged out of the church herself, and reflected the work of the church herself amongst the poor, which I think can more effectively provide for the poor in many ways than impersonal bureaucratic welfare states. I think perhaps that sums up my thoughts. Good.
Yeah, so first, thank you very much, Juan, for organizing all of this, and first and foremost, the Spanish edition. Also, thanks for everyone attending here and online. I'll add to what Philip mentioned, which I fully share. The idea is, in addition to bring forth the perspective, let's say from a broadly but not sort of homogeneous, not fully homogeneous, free market perspective, pro-trade, in many ways pro-globalization, because we felt and we still feel that this is both often on the political spectrum on the left and on the right, perhaps increasingly so now on the right, undervalued. And as the sort of more common political speech, and often even political speech which claims Catholic values or Catholic perspectives, is often not fully in tune with this. This was one of the key motivations for the project. We also had, and speaking from more from the Portuguese speaking side of things. So both the website and the book and the contents are available not just in English and in Spanish, but also in Portuguese. We have a number of partners from the Portuguese speaking world, so Brazil, Mozambique, Cape Verde, so a number of Portuguese speaking countries. And I think also an important part of this, especially with the websites and social media presence, is to try to foster an ongoing dialogue about these issues of which this session is also a part of. So I think, and to close on this initial statement, it's also the idea that also regardless of your position, as long as it's well-founded and well-intended, that thinking about Catholic social teaching should really be a process, an open process, where people try to ground as best as possible their views, try to get the best possible perspectives from economics, from political science, from sociology, from history, and so on, and that we had developed this ongoing conversation, which really was, if we look back at when the time it was called Catholic social thought, but Catholic thought actually was the dominant way of thought, at least in the West and in many ways in the world. If we look back in a way, that was what they were doing. So they didn't really, if you look at the scholastics and the late scholastics, they didn't really consider there were boundaries to what they approached. They thought anything that is human, that deals with society, also concerns me as a Catholic scholar. And so in our humble and certainly much more imperfect way, this is also part of what we're trying to do and trying to provide incentives for other people to do. So it's to go beyond sort of a perhaps more narrow focus that often Catholics and Catholic scholars have been pushed into, and sometimes they themselves have been directed to or directed themselves and sort of engage with the broader world and with the big questions out there, which means you won't always get it right. We certainly don't claim we always get it right, but it's important to have these perspectives and to have a say in these debates.
Thank you, Professor Oswald. Well, as Alves, I keep on going back to the Spanish version of your survey.
Just no, don't worry. I've done a number of PhD examinations in Spain, and the two things I know I always count is I'll be Professor Azevedo or Acevedo. So and also, and the other thing is that people will insist that even though my Spanish is not good, they will insist that I speak. That I try to speak Spanish for.
Well, you know.
So,
all Portuguese people. So every Spaniard knows that every Portuguese speaks Spanish, and every Spaniard thinks. Every Spaniard thinks that they also know Portuguese.
Right.
They are usually right on the first one and wrong on the second one. But anyway, so thank you very much to both of you. So let's go to globalization. So you both touched on that, especially you, Philip. So my generation, say, we've been crushed by at least three crises as of late, right? So the 2008 financial crisis, very much a global crisis, particularly perhaps in the West. Then the 2020 pandemic, and then the 2022 war in Ukraine, right? Especially in Europe, as it works when it comes to the impact of it. So globalization kind of under-delivered, to say the least. And on the one, that might be the perception, I believe, when it comes to labor market opportunities, when it comes to investment, when it comes to wealth creation, to productivity, etc. At the same time, the architecture of we could refer to as the international liberal order has also under-delivered insofar as has proven to be, and I'm being perhaps extremely harsh on it, but incapable of coming up with global solutions for global crises. So there's dissatisfaction with globalization when it comes to economics, when it comes to trade, but also with the architecture of global governance that also deal with. So what should be kind of the right way of looking at things from a Catholic perspective?
Yeah, okay.
And also, if I may, Philip, because Andrew touched on this when it comes to the new rights, or the fact that increasingly the right is criticizing globalization. So new right-wing movements, political movements, they seem to be increasingly in favor of the thesis that you can have free markets or free trade. You can have both, as if you can if you want to protect free market kind of internally, you need to literally raise barriers to trade.
Okay, that's a multi-layered question. Remind me if I don't manage to
I will,
do it
I
a
will,
little bit.
I
Yes,
will.
okay. Yeah, I mean, you've listed 3 crises. I don't think those crises are anything compared with the multi-decadal demographic crisis that's on its way. But and so you say globalization is under-delivered, and I know you said perceived to have under-delivered. Yeah, okay, that is a fairly wide perception. I think you then have to sort of continue and say, well, compared with what? So this era of globalization really came to an end around 2011, 2012, stagnated for a while, and then went into reverse in roughly in 2016 with Trump. Then Biden actually carried on Trump's policies, and now Trump seems to have doubled down.
Maybe Brexit as well.
Maybe Brexit. We can come on to that another time.
That's good.
Okay. I wasn't in favour of Brexit. Now, this was an era. No, this was a 40-year period where the proportion of people living in absolute poverty fell from about 40% of the world, when the world's population was 4 billion, to about 8% of the world when the world's population was 8 billion. That's a staggering achievement. And if when Populorum Progressio was published by Pope Paul VI in 1967, somebody had stood up and said, this will happen, nobody would have believed them. Now, I know, and the prefect for the dicastery for integral human development said at the launch of Dilexite, well, you know, we need to take into account the fact that we can't sort of measure poverty by sort of living standards of the past because things have improved. Well, in a sense, that's the point. You know, but it's also the case that back in 1980, only about 40% of the world's population had electricity, and now 90% of the world's population has electricity. So, now, you look at other statistics in terms of literacy, maternal deaths, even deaths from environmental problems and so on. All these have improved hugely. Now, this certainly was not just because of globalization. It was also because of the other things that I mentioned of governance improving in countries becoming more democratic. You know, even countries like China, which then sadly went into reverse as well in 2013 and became more oppressive again. It was a whole range of factors which combined together. And whatever problems you might identify with globalization, and I think Pope Francis was very astute actually at identifying problems, both economic but also cultural problems, which are perhaps more important in some senses to Catholics, and wrote very eloquently, I think, on how to deal with these problems of not getting trapped in a globalized world where you don't really belong anywhere, but on the one hand not getting trapped in a parochial world where you can't see the world outside your village. So we wrote very well about those things. Whatever the perceived problems of globalization, I don't think protectionism and deglobalization provide any kind of reasonable answer, because these things are responsible for creating tensions in the world. They're responsible for creating tensions within countries and between countries. They're responsible for making people poorer, and they're responsible also for taking the political system, turning it into a sort of bargaining process whereby people bargain through the political process for protection for their particular industries. We move from a position of cooperation to a position of conflict when we move into a world of deglobalization and protectionism. And I think it's a very dangerous world, and it isn't looking very pretty. Now, with regard to the world international order, mean, Pope Francis again has written brilliantly on this. The Catholic Church has always been supportive of some form of world governance, coming really from the observations of the late scholastics about human rights being universal. If human rights are universal, the common good is a universal concept. And whilst you might want what's a layer of world governance to do to be very, very limited, perhaps enforcing human rights where they're not enforced, having some kind of layer of world government makes sense. But then, as Pope Francis has pointed out, these institutions have been captured very often by their bureaucracies and are promoting not only things which are antithetical to the Catholic faith, but they're promoting pretended rights, such as the right to abortion, which are not only not part of the charters of these organizations, but they're promoted aggressively by the bureaucracies which control the organizations, which are not properly restrained by the countries which are members. And in addition to that, world governance or those things for which you'd like international cooperation, peace building, protection of proper human rights, perhaps action in relation to climate change. These things become much more difficult in a world where people believe that they pursue their own economic and political interests by being hostile to other countries and cutting themselves off from other countries. But also, sadly, again, the world is becoming more autocratic. It's becoming less democratic. Those things which improved in the period from 1980 to 2012 or so have gone into reverse again. About half the world's population live in countries where Christians are either persecuted or discriminated against. So you create an institution of international governance made up of countries where half of them are persecuting Christians. How do you expect those institutions to be able to deal with promoting human rights, peace building, and so on? It becomes very difficult. So whatever the church believes about international institutions, they can't solve every problem. These problems must be solved at a more local level.
Very well.
Okay, didn't mention that.
No, that's absolutely fine. And Andre, if you want to also discuss it, perhaps also regarding metrics, that attest to the success of globalization. You also mentioned earlier, inequality, not just lifting people out of poverty, but inequality. However, I'm intrigued because you just mentioned that the vast majority of people living in these other countries. So is there a divide between the West and the rest also when it comes to the fruits of globalization, right? Are we the losers of this, or has this been evenly distributed? I'm sorry.
Okay. No, the gains have not been evenly distributed. I mean, if a country is already relatively free trading and has a free and open economy and good governance and so on, you wouldn't expect it to gain considerably from globalization. Although I think the West has gained, and problems of stagnation, unemployment, and so on have causes which are not related to globalization. We could discuss those if you wish. There's no doubt that the gainers from globalization have been those countries which previously isolated themselves entirely from the world economy, particularly in Asia, but not just in Asia, and became more integrated with economic life, but simultaneously also became more democratic, protected rights better, and created a better environment in which business could operate. So if you start off at a low level, to take the clearest example, perhaps Vietnam, almost a Maoist permanent kingdom, and you improve things somewhat. Vietnam is not nearly as bad as China as far as the persecution of Christians is concerned, and other human rights issues. Then you would expect much more rapid growth, even if they don't in any way catch up with the West, than if you already start from a reasonably well-developed economy that is trading with the rest of the world. Vietnam probably has reduced poverty more rapidly than any country in the economic history of the world. You know, gone from about 90% of the country living in poverty to absolute poverty to close to zero within 30 years. That type of thing has just never happened before.
Yeah, on globalization, I think one aspect which is really interesting, and I'm not pointing it out with a specific conclusion, but just as food for thought, is that 20 years ago, being pro-free trade and pro-globalization clearly marked you on the right, right? And in a relatively short period of time, I sometimes teach a course on global political economy. And I sometimes, when I explain this to my students, I say, well, in a way, all those anti-globalization protesters on the far left in the early 2000s, Donald Trump's protectionism is their wishes come true, right? So in a relatively short period of time, what was sort of fringe, very noisy, but fringe, I mean, the more mature people in this room will remember the anti-globalization protests in major cities, stuff burning, stores being destroyed, and so on. And what they were asking for, I mean, I'm not claiming they like Trump, they don't for a whole set of reasons. But the trade policy they were asking for is the trade policy Donald Trump and not all, but many politicians on the new rights are pushing for, which I think is again, there's no inherent conclusion to this, but I think it's interesting in this context to think. Second point, which I think is interesting to this, and also goes the way ideas flow in public opinion and so on. And we have more data on this from the United States, but I think similar phenomena exists elsewhere, is that voters also, a large portion of voters also change their views on trade and globalization following the change of views from their political leaders. So, for example, in the US, Republicans were usually quite aligned with free trade and globalization, and this has also very substantially changed. Which I think, going back to the book and Catholic social teaching, reinforces the need to look at these issues more in depth and trying to avoid something which for people who are engaged in current politics is very hard to avoid, because that's the nature of current politics. A successful politician has to deal with the matters of the day, right? But trying to avoid falling prey, being hostage to these sort of short-term trends. And like Philip was mentioning, not only did we have an unprecedented economic development, but inequality, if we look at it, and I'll go about unequal effects within developed countries, but inequality globally has had a completely unprecedented reduction, because we had millions and millions and millions of people who were in absolute poverty, and as an outcome of this process have risen themselves out of this. And the fact that this is so absent from public debate, I think is quite striking. And I think there's a moral imperative, particularly for those who approach the issue from a Catholic perspective, to bring this to the forefront, right? Because those are the basic conditions for human flourishing, and the fact that you have this large part of humanity where this has happened and this is linked with the process, I think this is very important. And there's a risk in simply sort of ignoring this, taking for granted that we'll always have these benefits no matter what policies are implemented. I think this is far from certain. Now, something that Juan alluded to, which I think is very important, and I think to explain politically what we are observing, or to try to explain, is that we did have in developed countries, in many cases, the gains from this process were very unequally distributed. Not so much in terms of not having absolute gains. In most cases, we did have absolute gains across the board. But we did have, and this has a number of potential explanations. So human capital, the return on human capital with globalization and with technology increased. So if you're well educated and if you're well connected, you're able to make more of those connections and that education. And if you're less educated, less skilled in a developed country, you still enjoy a number of things, but in relative terms, you're stuck, right? And I think it was largely this perception of people who see this abundance growing around them, and these elites sort of becoming richer and becoming more affluent and so on, that largely provided the support for the counter-globalization movement. So the idea is not so much, I don't think there's resentment against people in poorer countries becoming richer. I think there's probably not enough awareness of that and of how that is important, but I don't think there's not any ill sentiment about that. But I do think there's ill sentiment about this perception of unequal distribution. Just one final note. Philip mentioned that trade is also very important, and that's something that is covered in several chapters of the book for social cooperation. I would add it's also important for international peace. And I think you mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think one thing, unfortunately, we'll probably discover in coming years is that this reversal in relatively free trade, we never have unfettered free trade, but in relatively free trade and globalization, we'll have a price which is not just an economic price, it will have a price in blood. So it will have a price in intensification of border conflicts, in intensification of religious conflicts, and also, to conclude this point, in terms of pressures for migration. Because if you're concerned about migration, if you don't want huge pressures of people coming from other countries, and if you think there are problems with that, then that would be, at least to my mind, another clear reason to push for free trade. If you want to bring back, which is one of the, to me, silliest arguments that protectionists make, you want to bring back industry, right? So we're gonna bring back industry to the US, we're gonna bring back industry to Spain or Portugal or whatever, the UK, right? Who's gonna work in those industries? Right? So how can at the same time, and often the same political support basis, be saying, we're concerned about the huge influx of people in a short period of time and the ability to assimilate and to integrate, which I think are very, we have also a chapter on migration, a very, I think, balanced chapter. Those are legitimate concerns, and I think those ought to be discussed. But at the same time, you're pushing for protectionist policies, where one of the indirect but very strong results of those protectionist policies, if they are implemented, is to generate huge pressures for more migration, for more immigration from a developed country's perspective.
Do you want us to continue this?
Yeah, one final point that I would like you to discuss before we go to social justice, actually,
Okay.
which is this balance between, so you mentioned human flourishing, which is a term, a concept, increasingly spreads across the Anglosphere, particularly. Now, where does it, come into play the principle of subsidiarity when it comes to nationhoods and when it comes to globalization? Especially considering that I assume, I haven't run the numbers, but I assume most Catholics are very much patriotic in that good way, right? So is it human flourishing of the entire world, or is it human flourishing of my community first? Meaning, this divide between the West and the rest, and among the West, my country, or any particular country. And then we go, I promise, to social justice.
The two are quite related. Am I allowed to make another point on inequality?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to use a sporting analogy
Okay.
here. Well, it's not an analogy, it's an example. But you could equally use a business example to explain this point about the huge increase in income. So in the United Kingdom, inequality has actually remained pretty flat for 40 years. But the top 1% have pulled away from the bottom 9% of the top 10%. The top 1% have become very, very rich. And I don't think there's any doubt that globalization is a strong aspect of this. And a good example here, but you could use a business example too, is sports stars. So England have only won the World Cup once in 1966, as people know, and the captain of the team was a chap called Bobby Moore. He was only able to play in front of about 35 or 40,000 people every Saturday, and that was it. There might have been a radio broadcast, but that would have been worth nothing commercially. No television, and certainly nobody outside the local area where he was playing could possibly have watched him. The equivalent person today could be watched by 1 billion, 2 billion people on television. And of course, the player can get the benefit of the sale of those television rights, and all of the, of course, all of the people watching are getting the benefit of being able to watch the match too. And they all pay a small fee to do that, and the player ends up with a tiny proportion of that small fee multiplied by 1.4 billion or whatever, 50 times a year. And he becomes incredibly rich. Not only that, of course, he could wear boots which are sponsored, which instead of being seen by 30,000 people, are seen by 1 or 2 billion people, and he becomes really, really rich. So, and Catholic social teaching, I think, in the past was perhaps better at articulating what the real responsibilities of the rich were. I think we've come to assume, and this is relevant to the point about subsidiarity, that the responsibilities of the rich end when they pay their tax bill. They don't. The responsibilities of the rich to the poor are much more profound than that. So on the question of subsidiarity and human flourishing, when we talk about human flourishing, do we mean the whole world? Yes, of course, we mean the whole world. But in order to flourish as a global community, we need to be able to flourish as a community at the local level. And although our economic relationships can be with people that we've never met before all over the world, our real human fraternal relationships, which in many respects are more important for human flourishing, do have to be at the local level. And I think that's where the treatment of the welfare state is important, which appears in the book in a couple of chapters. One in a chapter by Bob Kennedy on taxation, and another in a chapter on our system of health provision in the UK, the National Health Service, by Russell Sparks. That's these systems of state provision of welfare have undermined systems of provision of welfare which were much more locally based, based on fraternity, based on mutualism, based on people who actually needed to know the real condition of the people who needed help in order that they could provide the right type of help. And that's being replaced essentially by systems of state provision of welfare, where the answer is always providing a check. That has to be the answer, because the bureaucracy which is running a state system of welfare can't intimately know the needs of the person they're trying to help well enough. And this was a point really which Pope Francis made about globalization, which there's a couple of paragraphs. I can't remember whether it's quoted in the book or not, or whether he actually made it after the book was edited. But it's in Fratelli Tutti, and it's about how, as I mentioned, we shouldn't become citizens of nowhere. We need to be rooted within communities, but we don't need to become so rooted in our communities and closed off from the rest of the world that we end up, and he actually used this phrase, like museums, unable and unwilling to change. And I might add, such communities are often unable and unwilling to welcome migrants, of which of course Pope Francis was very keen that we should welcome and integrate migrants. So I don't think that maybe this issue between the local and the global needs to be unpicked and discussed, but they're not contradictions.
That's what I think.
Yeah, I just first like Philip mentioned, and I agree. Just from a Catholic perspective, the concern about human flourishing will be global. I think the only answer is a clear yes. So I don't think there's any, and that is whereas there might be disagreements on a number of economic matters and economic policies, but I think that the concern should be universal. The meaning of Catholic is universal, as we all know. That to me is quite clear. Now, this doesn't mean a specific endorsement, you mentioned a bit ago, international liberal order. And I'd like to just very briefly into the issue of subsidiarity, also go back to that. I think part of the problem, and I'm very critical, namely of the protectionist impulses that we're seeing now. And I think people who are pushing for those policies are mostly wrong. And I think it's very important that there's pushback against those protectionist impulses. But having said this, I think part of the responsibility also lies with, in the previous decades, the way this international, so-called international liberal order was built up and defended. Because often there are many institutions, you already made some allusion to this, of this international liberal order, which were not very liberal and were not very orderly. And if you look, say, at the United Nations,
Not very international.
not very international, yeah. If you look at the
Regional.
if you look at the United Nations, if you look how the United Nations understanding of human rights and so on and so forth, what we often see is that, and I think that's part of the reason why the pushback is now so strong and has such support, is that this was often instrumentalized for very specific political agendas, say, be it on social and moral issues, very progressive agendas, geopolitically for very specific interests, and even on trade, what passed for free trade, or what was pushed for, even though the label was freer trade, was often not particularly liberal or free trade in itself. And so when you now have a pushback, I think part of what fuels this pushback is that the existing order, particularly in terms of the political infrastructure. So I think we need to make a clear distinction about the economic gains and the social cooperation and the gains that came from people freely interacting with each other globally and social cooperation. And on the other hand, the global political infrastructure that was developed hand in hand with this. And I think that global infrastructure has had and still has serious problems. And I think in a way, the big challenge for us today, and for people trying to think about these matters from a Catholic perspective, is how and to what extent may we be able to preserve and foster the good aspects of globalization and free trade and international cooperation, while at the same time giving meaningful and let's say politically viable responses to the problems with the political infrastructure, which I think are real. And I think the balance here is trying the very hard balance, because I mean politically it's always a political message is always stronger if you say we're just gonna blow the whole thing up, right? We don't like this and we're against this and we're gonna bring the whole thing down. So nuance is and especially in the age of social media and so on, it's very hard to pass. But I think that's the big challenge. How do we preserve the good aspects while at the same time recognizing there were serious problems that need to be tackled? There needs to be serious reform and serious change, and perhaps in some cases, even abolition of some of these institutions, but without, through this process, going back to sort of a more closed world, so let's say a pre-19th century world, which I really think is not something we want to go back to.
Absolutely. Okay, let us speak now of social justice. One of the hot topics of our day, I suppose. Very controversial, very divisive. People either seem to love the term or despise it, hate it. So what's social justice? What does it mean under a Catholic framework? And to what extent, like when you talk about it, does it affect both intergenerational solidarity, for example, when it comes to debt, right, public debt, or having a fiscal policy properly balanced, etc., and also when it comes or when it affects taxation.
Okay. It's a tricky one because I think the term social justice is quite widely misunderstood. and actually, if I answered your question directly, I would compound that misunderstanding. I think so. Social justice in Catholic teaching is that form of justice by which we promote the common good, essentially. In other words, promote those conditions which allow all people to reach fulfillment and perfection. And that's distinct from social justice, as is often taught on political economy courses and so on and so forth, which really is about how wealth and income are distributed, as suggested, as proposed by Rawls in his famous work, and as critiqued by Hayek in his equally famous work. And I mean, social justice has been around as a concept in Catholic teaching really forever, but it was only really given that term social justice in the mid 19th century. And the sorts of issues that you raised, taxation and government debt, they do pertain to questions of social justice, but perhaps not in the way which might be first thought of. So there's no doubt that government debt and also the welfare systems that we've devised at a time of demographic decline are going to lead to huge burdens on future generations of workers in order to fund both the explicit government debt, but also the welfare, pensions, healthcare, and so on for the older generation. And that's an issue which Pope Benedict has mentioned, Pope Francis has mentioned, and Pope Francis had a whole section of Laudato Si on intergenerational justice between the generations. He was relating that issue, of course, to environmental degradation and climate change, but the issues are essentially the same for government debt. That it's wrong for a given generation to consume in such a way that it potentially harms future generations. That's what we do if we degrade the environment. It's what we do if we encourage our governments to spend too much and take on debt. It's what we do if we promise ourselves pensions and healthcare without putting the funds aside to finance it. Now, technically, in Catholic social teaching, there are issues of distributive justice rather than social justice. But the two are linked. Now, insofar as increased government debt, increased welfare payments, demographic decline, and so on, lead to disaffection within society, disaffection particularly amongst younger people who see their tax bills rising and welfare to working age people falling, potentially disaffection amongst older people as the promises that were made to them for pensions and healthcare in old age can't be fulfilled. If this leads to tensions within political systems, ultimately potentially civil disorder, the rise of populism, maybe the overthrow of democratic rule. In the past countries, Scotland, Newfoundland, now parts of Canada, it wasn't originally, have actually lost their independence as a result of debt. Goodness knows what would have happened to Greece without the bailout in the Euro crisis. This leads to certainly a breakdown in both the economic, social, and political conditions that are necessary, I think, for true human flourishing and fulfillment. So there are social justice issues as well, but perhaps not in the way you described. In
Distributed justice would be a better term to refer to this.
Refer to the sort of transfer between
Generation.
your generation and my generation, and the one that benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I'll have much to add on this topic. I think this is an important, it's a topic it's a concept my own views have evolved over time, because I was initially very much shaped precisely by the Rawls, Nozick, Hayek debates, where social justice is associated with essentially redistribution, right? And there is, as Philip already mentioned, going back to authors like Cosmini and others in the 19th century, an actually richer and deeper tradition of the term, which is also much broader. So issues, say, of sentences people are given for crimes, the prison system, those are also issues of social justice, and they don't have to do with income or redistribution in the sense, but from this broader perspective of social justice, one would say they are in many respects more fundamental than whether there's this, where it's 1 point higher in taxation or redistribution. So I think it's important, and I in this topic I leave it at that. I think it's important that those analyzing these issues from a Catholic perspective avoid two risks. One is of simply, which was my case for a number of years, reacting against this and saying, okay, this is essentially another word for radical socialism, and so I don't want to engage with that. I want to reject it. I think for that it is important to go back to this deeper, richer tradition, and basically not to give up the concept. The second risk, I think, is to, which does in a way the same mistake, but in an opposite way, is to critically accept sort of the secular contemporary views, especially from on the progressive far left about social justice, and just say, okay, because the word is the same, we're all on the same page and we're all defending the same thing. There may be alignments, but certainly there's a risk if we just accept these contemporary notions as being the whole of it, which I certainly think is not the case.
Yeah, that's great. And there is a danger within the Catholic community. I don't know whether it happens in Portugal and Spain, but certainly it happens in America and the UK. Maybe not so much in the UK, but certainly in America, where conservatives use the phrase social justice Catholics pejoratively to describe those on the left. And those on the left actually wear the badge social justice Catholics really quite proudly. And that shouldn't be so. No, we should all be social justice Catholics, and life issues are social justice. Life issues are a social justice issue. Gender issues to do with gender, sexuality, and so on are also social justice issues, and they're all connected with each other.
I'm not thought of myself as a social justice warrior, but I will from now. Yeah, I have to. That's good. That's good. So I don't know how much time we've got left.
But may I just mention that? Yeah, I mean, I work for the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. Life issues are reside within the Department for Social Justice in our Bishops' Conference, because life issues are regarded as a pinnacle of social justice issues.
Without life, you have not much. Yeah,
Exactly.
Good. So I don't know how much time left we've got. Perhaps there's time for some questions, if there are any. Okay, that's fine. Actually, I wanted to take a few minutes, few more minutes of your time to ask you, perhaps this was supposed to be the very first question, which is, where does Catholic social thought really, not necessarily Catholic social teaching, but what's the difference between the two, come from? And the book cover, and this is my patriotic duty here. So the book cover features the city of Salamanca, right? And I suppose this is a clue to the tradition or the heritage of also the original tradition. So there you go. Thank you, Anglosphere, for that. So the tradition of the School of Salamanca, which really was, and I not only say this because of having Andre to my right, was really a circuit of universities, right? It was the School of Salamanca, School of the University of Salamanca, sorry, the University of Valladolid, Alcalá de Henares, Coimbra, Évora in Portugal, many others, the Americas afterwards. So where does it come from? Is it the Aquinas? Is it Aristotle? Is it Aquinas? Is it the late scholastics? So what's this tradition of political thought, of economic thought, and some would even say the birth of economics as a science, really. So if you could elaborate on that, that would, I think, be also very educational.
This is definitely your turn.
Okay. So first on and very quickly, because I'm aware of the hour. First, the distinction between Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought. Not sure in Spanish, but Juan will help me. But in Portuguese, it's the distinction between what we call doutrina social da Iglesia and pensamento social católico. So that would be, yeah. So Catholic social teaching, being the doctrina, right? It's the way we approach it. Some people use it interchangeably, which I don't think is very helpful. So we also co-teach in NAMI Catholic social teaching in St. Mary's.
Yeah.
And
Misnamed.
which is misnamed because actually Catholic social thought, but we are not responsible for that. We try to explain. It's an ongoing fight. And that's in the very first sessions we tried to explain this. So Catholic social teaching, the doctrina, right? We think that it's best to understand it as being more directly linked with the official documents of the church, namely the encyclicals. There are no actually formally social encyclicals, but people refer, and I don't think it's unhelpful to think of social encyclicals. They're all social encyclicals, but the study of these documents and of the thought process that went into them, they're all, I mean, of course, they're signed by the Pope, but they're collective documents, all of them. They've always been, with very few exceptions, collective documents throughout history. So Catholic social teaching, I think that we think the best way to think about it is around the study of these documents, the thought that we went into them, their impact, and so on. Catholic social thought is, in our view, a much broader concept, which deals with essentially all thought, political, economic, social matters, philosophy, which incorporates in some way, doesn't even need to be, say, by a practicing Catholic who goes to mass or whatever, but that incorporates Catholic elements. And so what we would say, if we accept this definition, is that Catholic social teaching is born out of Catholic social thought, but Catholic social thought is much wider than the Catholic social teaching. Of course, the two are connected, right? I mean, we cannot think of the two as completely separate, but we should make a distinction. It's not very useful, for example, if we reduce Catholic social thought to Catholic social teaching, and this is not to downplay Catholic social teaching. Just to note, Philip is also not aware. I was saving that for dinner, but I mean, it only takes 30 seconds. I was recently involved in a small working group to reform the what we call in Portugal the mission curricula units. So the mission courses at the Catholic University of Portugal. Core curriculum, right? And one of the things we dealt with a very small group, the rector, and then 7 people from different units. And one of the things we dealt with was this. And I'm very glad that was not the only thing I did in the group. We met like 8 times over the course of a year. So hopefully I did more than that in the group. But one thing that I was very glad was that I was able to persuade my colleagues and the rector that we should have one unit in the core curriculum that is Doutrina Social da Igreja, so Catholic social teaching, and a different unit, which will be called Tradição de Pensamento Católico, so it will be called the tradition of Catholic thought, right? And initially, when I told this to my colleagues in economics or education, but isn't it the same thing, right? No, it's not the same thing. And I think it's important that we make a distinction and also that we study the relationship between the two, right? That we study at each moment in time what elements of Catholic social thought is Catholic social teaching incorporating or not? In what ways is it incorporating? Why is it incorporating that way? Because that is also very helpful for our understanding for the evolution of Catholic social teaching. Just one brief note, we have the one of the first chapters is precisely about the late Scholastic Aquinas and the late Scholastics. So within this tradition of Catholic social thought, for reasons which we develop in that chapter in the book, so I will point you towards the book, we think there's a very good case can be made that even though there's, of course, very relevant Catholic social thought before, there are 2 big marks. Aquinas, which for the first time deals with many of the issues that then become sort of standard in Catholic social thought, that in a way which then largely became standard. And then because of the context of what we can call the first globalization, go back to globalization, and how Iberia, Portugal, and Spain were central to this. So it's no coincidence that Salamanca was the main intellectual center, and that other universities in Spain and Portugal were also the main centers there. That they developed this reasoning from Aquinas, applying it in ways that had not been applied before because the problems had not risen in the same way. Economic, social, even the universal nature of human rights, and so on. And so we believe that in this trajectory of development of Catholic social thought, so it doesn't start with Aquinas, but Aquinas is a main mark. The late scholastics in the 16th and 17th century are a main mark. And in a way, paying homage to that, it's the reason we picked Salamanca for the English edition. We reproduced it in the Spanish edition. I'm sad to say that the publisher in Portugal did not allow Salamanca. So we're going to have a different cover, but Salamanca and certainly the Iberian scholastic tradition is well present as well.
That's good. Wonderful. Would you like to add anything to that? No. Are there any questions now? I think. Well, thank you very much, both of you, making the effort to come to Madrid this rainy day, looking to the Spanish sun. Well, thank you again to UMSA, to the University of Navarra, to the Masters in Cristianismo y Cultura Contemporánea, que también ha coorganizado este encuentro.